When the rocket carved its way through the British countryside in 1830, it was the climax of a time that became known as the Industrial Revolution. The puzzle facing these historians is why this transformation happened when and where it did. So far, they've gone back 100 years to investigate why inventors tried to make machines that mimicked life, and how backers got to hear of these ideas through a network of clubs. By going back further, over 250 years, they showed how a thirst for exploring and exploiting the natural world set the stage for industrial growth. Now they will look at changes over 500 years. In 1350, Britain was a relatively backward island of little consequence. Like the rest of Europe, it faced plague and war. The monasteries were the corporate giants of the time, and they would play a vital part in Europe's emergence from the Dark Ages. Yet this was far from the center of the civilized world. China, with its long history of literary and inventive genius, was the most powerful empire on earth at this time. The question is why, over the next 5 centuries, there was a reversal of fortune. To help solve this puzzle, the historians will focus on 2 critical technologies that were absent in the East, but exploded in the West. The first is the mechanical clock. The second is glass. These inventions would have a profound impact on people's perception of time and space. The clock was not only a machine, it was the driving mechanism for the organization of work.
Your relationship with your employer was absolutely mediated through clocks. Manufacturers like Josiah Wedgwood began to install telltale clocks which governed the hours at which every potter in Wedgwood's factory would work. And those telltale clocks told the tale of a new rhythm of industrial production. The rhythm of mechanical production started to govern the rhythm at which people were able to work and the rhythm at which they were forced to work, so that clocking on started to dominate the way in which people understood their own labor time. People could be fired from British factories if they could tell the time themselves, so that the only clock that they were allowed to trust was the one that belonged to the factory. So the relationship between wage labor and the experience of work and the regular beating of the mechanical clock was an intimate, pervasive, and in the end, terrifying one.
Most societies in the world managed without clocks. So how did this European obsession with time begin?
Did a society really need very precise time measurements and clocks, and so it invented a mechanical clock? Or was the presence of the mechanical clock something that then generated a huge amount of obsession with precise timekeeping? Now, most people think, well, there was a lackadaisical attitude towards time, and then the clock came along and everyone became obsessed by time. But there's a rather intriguing theory that it's the other way around.
So what was it about medieval Europe that created a need to measure time? The earliest clocks have disappeared, probably because they were dismantled for spare parts. This one at St. Albans Abbey is a modern replica built from the abbot's original plans.
No one really knows about the origins of mechanical clockwork in Western Europe in the Middle Ages. One rather suggestive connection, one which I like, is that rather quickly in the 13th and 14th century, you see, certainly in Northern Europe, the introduction of the word clock in most of the vulgar languages. And clock comes from the word for bell, cloche. So it seems to me that a very plausible story about the origin of mechanical clockwork is that it develops gradually but inexorably from automating bells.
Now, the argument often focuses on the role of religious orders, and particularly the Benedictines. The argument really is that very early on, when the Benedictine orders were set up in the early Middle Ages, there was strict rules about what you should do and when you should do it. You should pray at intermittent intervals right through the day and the night, every 3 or 6 hours. In order to regularly pray in this way, they had to be woken up, and they often had to wake up in the middle of winter on a cold day. What is going to wake them up?
Alan MacFarlane visited Britain's oldest working Benedictine monastery, Pluscarden Abbey in the far north of Scotland.
Some people have said clocks equals Benedictines, Benedictines equal clocks. How could there be such an equation?
Interesting. I've heard clocks equal gunners or clocks equals locksmiths, I suppose, just because they are makers thereof, but perhaps clocks equals Benedictines as users thereof, because if you have a need to divide time or predict time or chop it off into bits, then obviously a clock, if it works, it is good for that. In his rules, St. Benedict lays down the times for the different things to be done, from when you get up, and when you pray, and when you work, when you eat, quite carefully distributed. It's a balanced life, something for the head, something for the heart, something for the hands.
I've heard a rather interesting idea that basically what the Benedictines did was to enclose space and time, physically in their architecture, socially in their social organization, and then divide it all up into tiny bits. So in a sense they were a living clock, a kind of physical social clock in their order. All that happened was that they miniaturized it down into an actual physical object, which then became a mechanical clock.
The genius of the Benedictines was to translate the continuous flow of heavenly time into discrete units. The earliest clocks were driven by the energy of raised weights, which turned a central gear wheel. But the rotation of this wheel was blocked by an escapement mechanism, an ingenious device which allowed alternating pegs on two wheels to slide by or stop. The backwards and forwards motion was controlled by a pair of counterweights. The clock was the first digital machine.
Richard of Wallingford, the abbot of St. Albans, was a smart young Oxford mathematician who inaugurates the construction of this extraordinarily expensive and complex clock, which will not only tell the hours using this kind of mechanism, but also show the motion of the heavens, of the moon, of the planets, and even of the tides. So this was a machine which not only told the time regularly according to the rule of St. Benedict, but it displayed for everybody the power and wealth of this institution, and, as we might say, above all, it showed that through machinery, through mechanical ingenuity, the Abbey was the representative on earth of what God was doing in the heavens.
If the monastic tradition in the West led to mechanical clocks and the organization of work, then there is a further puzzle. Why didn't Buddhism, which also had a strong monastic tradition, lead to similar developments in the East? As an anthropologist, Alan McFarlane regularly visits Nepal, where Buddhism is one of the major religions.
On first view, Catholics and Buddhists look very similar. They're both ethical religions with a lot of hard work and prayer. And so they look like the two world religions which would have led towards modernity. And yet, one of them, Christianity, did lead towards technology and science, and one of them, Buddhism, didn't. The aim of a Christian was to shape the world around him, to bring it into line with his own spiritual needs and the needs of God. So he interfered in the practical world, inventing gadgets and tools and modifying and using animals and plants as his servants to praise God. Whereas Buddhists retreated into a spiritual world where they turned in on themselves. They developed very elaborate and beautiful rituals which involve lights and wheels and prayers and chanting and music. But they had very little impact on the material world. So one changed the material world and one adapted to it, and that's really the difference.
By the 16th century, clocks in Europe were becoming increasingly elaborate.
What if you think about medieval mechanical clockwork and the automata, the figures of citizens, of the devil, of the dance of death, all those wonderful theatres that mechanical theatres that one sees displayed in market clocks, especially, and church clocks throughout late medieval Europe. What if one thinks about that not only in terms of the effect it has on how people work and don't work, when they pray and when they don't, but if one thinks about it also through the effect it has on the notion of the machine? Because clearly one of the things that's happening is that one's worked out a way of telling time that has nothing to do with heaven. And that's absolutely remarkable. That one can almost, as it were, set up a clock system which you barely have to calibrate with heaven. So that this is a profoundly terrestrial device. In the heavens, everything is orderly, and the motion of objects is in perfect circles or combinations of circles. It is the residence of God and the angels. And what the mechanical clock does is at least to bring down from heaven the capacity to tell regular, ordered time, which up till then had been referred to the motion of the sun and the other planets.
On the other side of the world, in China, there was also great interest in the motion of the heavens. The puzzle is why it led to a society with a different sense of time.
The Chinese scheme of how you ought to plan your life very much lays stress on doing things at the right time. If you don't do a ritual at the right time, if you don't conduct medical treatment at the right time, if you get married at the wrong time, things will go badly awry. So knowing exactly what moment things should be done at is very important in China. And from the beginning of the Christian era, there's a long history of people at court making increasingly complicated devices for giving you a model of the cosmos that you can look at, that is changing as the cosmos changes. It starts off with people making, say, an armillary sphere, which is essentially just a model of the great circles of astronomical coordinates, the celestial equator and so on. The culmination of this comes in the 11th century when an official called Su Sung sets up a house-sized device, an immense water-powered clock which has on it certainly, yes, an armillary sphere rotating in tune with the heavens, so you can sort of write stars in the place you'd expect it to be, but also all kinds of jacks and what I can only call clockwork devices, causing you to know what hour it is, what planets are where, and so on, what stars are where, and so on. Bells ring to announce the passage of time.
Christopher Cullen believes that Su Song produced an escapement mechanism at least 2 centuries before the Europeans.
In Su Song's clock, it's the flow of water from a constant head tank, so the pressure is always the same, into a special weighing device which trips when a certain amount of water has gone in. So the wheel then goes round one clonk.
Yet mechanical clocks didn't develop any further in China, and the technical achievements of craftsmen like Su Song were forgotten.
Despite the fact that the Chinese court is very interested, essentially interested in having a good measure of time so it can do its jobs at the right moment, and ordinary Chinese people are too, it never actually comes to be the case that every Chinese town thinks it must have a public clock. There is a public annunciation of time in every large Chinese town from the drum tower. It's still there in Peking at the moment, where drums and bells tell you, when the hours of the day are passing. So in China, time was certainly publicly marked, but there's a subtle difference here between this time and time as it was marked by the public clocks of some of the cities of Europe. For a start, it wasn't during the day that people were told the time by the drums and the bells. It was at night. The drums sounded every 2 hours to mark the 5 night watches, so as to enable the officials to be ready for their dawn audiences, and to enable the watchmen to do their rounds and the guards to change their duties. This was time designed, certainly not for the citizen to time their work. This was not the sort of time that you and I carry around on our watches, but time that is imposed on us from above.
People working in the towns of Europe were much more aware of time. The clock had become an essential part of the everyday dance of life.
Every town in Europe that respected itself had a clock tower that gave the clock to anybody who wanted to look. And this is, I think, something which sets Europe a little bit apart from other societies that try to measure time. It's not just that they were interested in it, but that it was democratic. That it wasn't the emperor's time, or the king's time, or the duke's time. This was the time that everybody could look at.
Even when Western clocks were introduced to China in the early 17th century by visiting Jesuit priests, they had little impact on the country as a whole. Matteo Ricci, a missionary from Italy, used the emperor's fascination with clockwork to gain access to his palace. He was the first European to be admitted to the Forbidden City. For the emperor, the clocks were beautiful and amusing curios, but of no practical value, and they remained locked away in his private collection. The thing is, of course, that nobody really needs to know the time at all. It's a matter of cultural choice. There comes a time in the history of Europe where people decide that there is this thing called time that is slipping by minute, and that you all ought to measure it and decide to space out your activities, not by the fact that it's the middle of the day now and it's time for a meal, or it's getting towards night, so we'd better get in from the fields, but by saying, you shall work for me for a 10-hour day. I'm going to buy your time. Time becomes something like a piece of cloth with a length that you can sell bits of. And that choice was not yet made by the ordinary working people of China, who ran their time as everyone has always done, by dawn, dusk, and the middle of the day, the sun at its height. Nobody would be looking at this clock to say, I've just got time to nip down to the shops before I start my shift this afternoon.
It's not difficult to establish the impact of clocks on industrialization. The role of glass is more mysterious.
Glass has an extraordinary combination of properties. It's almost completely inert, so you can use it to store stuff. It's very transparent if you make it properly, so you can see what you've got inside. And it's malleable. You can turn it into a very large number of different shapes. And of course, because of its effect on light, you can use it to set light to things, or magnify them, bring them closer or further away, correct optical defects. And it's impossible to imagine, for example, modern sciences without glass, without telescopes and microscopes, without thermometers and barometers. It's impossible to imagine a huge range of industries, especially chemical technologies, without glass. Now that's an almost magical combination of properties, and to think about how the modern world's produced and how we get there, I think it's very important to look at who was able to make glass and why.
Glassmaking was an ancient craft known to the Phoenicians, Egyptians, and the Romans. By the 15th century, the best glassmakers came from Venice. Alan Macfarlane went to the island of Murano, where some of the finest craftsmen developed their skills.
The Italians, as we all know, make wonderful wine, and unlike hot drinks, this can be served up in glass. And so they began to realize that if you made this crystalline, clear, reflecting medium, you got the double effervescence of beauty to the eye and beauty in the stomach. And so they began to make more and more beautiful wine glasses, and of course this affected the technology, which got better and better.
The secrets of their craft became so valuable that they were not allowed to leave the island of Murano for fear of industrial espionage. Glassmaking became an important medieval industry across Europe. Just as the mechanical clock revolutionized the perception of time, so the use of glass changed Europeans' understanding of space.
Of course, most of the glass in the West is used, is it not, for vessels most of the time. That's right, isn't it?
No, it's true of southern Europe, which is the warm area where they drink wine, is for vessels.
Oh, and it's windows in the north to keep the weather out.
That's right. At first this is for beauty, for protection against the weather, for the glorification of God.
But gradually, as glass-making techniques improved, the demand for glass increased.
The manufacture of crown glass for windows became widespread. Tony Cummins, who's been making crown glass for 20 years, showed Alan Macfarlane the skills involved. The trick is to create a flat sheet from a large sphere of molten glass.
Presumably it has to be exactly the right timing.
Yeah, you've got to get an overall heat so it'll all open out straight.
As Tony spins the glass, centrifugal forces flatten the hollow sphere into a disc. Today, these are sometimes used in pubs and tea shops, but originally, the center was thrown away when the glass was cut into window panes. Monasteries and churches were among the first medieval institutions to use glass for windows. Soon they began to be installed in houses, and other buildings too.
The increased use of glass and clocks created a more orderly, controlled world. It was clearly seen in many homes with their enormous windows. Glass not only lets in more light, but it makes every mote of dust visible. With larger windows, there were no dark corners to hide traces of dirt. The windows created a new hygienic environment that began with the glass pane itself, the desire to have clean windows. Eventually, cleaning became an important ritual in everyday life that extended to scouring the floor and polishing utensils. So indirectly, glass wiped away disease. It also obviously extended the working day. For workmen, they could work into the evenings with glass windows. So it alters perception, it alters comfort, it alters working hours, it alters religion, every part of human life. But not in China, not in Japan, not in India, not in Islam, not in South America, not in Australia, not in South Africa. Just in this wet, cold, miserable part of northwest Europe, the great window revolution occurs. The West became flooded with glass, and this changed all sorts of things. It changed the ideas of space, time, the person, the individual. But there was one change that was particularly important, and that was that with glass you can make scientific instruments, you can draw it out in all sorts of shapes, so that you can make containers, you can make thermometers and barometers and telescopes and microscopes. And this made it possible to establish the fundamental laws of chemistry and physics. And without these laws, you couldn't have had a steam engine.
One of the crucial things that glass gave you was the production of large spaces. So blowing a receiver, as it's called, like this, is actually quite a complicated business. So a large space which you can see, which you can manipulate, and which you can control. Glass matters for air pumps in a very obvious way. These kinds of machines became indispensable tools for analyzing the way in which air moved and the behavior of fire and steam, because it soon became obvious that the processes which extinguish flame seem to be the same as the processes which extinguish life itself. Now, the kind of theoretical understanding of how air's pressure and air's weight really worked, and the role of air in keeping flame alive, were indispensable resources for the new fire engines, as they were called, that Savery and Newcomen then began to design in the early 1700s. So air pumps play an absolutely decisive role in the technology which leads to the construction of the first stationary steam engines.
The transparency and strength of glass had made it possible to investigate vacuums and understand the relationship between air pressure, volume, and temperature. But glass had another important property, which would transform people's view of the world.
Could you make a lens with that?
A very crude one. This is how perhaps the early lenses came about, by melting a piece of solid rod. As long as one turns regularly and melts it evenly, it then becomes a sphere, and particularly if I hold it up, you can see it gradually becoming spherical and thin.
I mean, the crucial thing about this rounded shape is that this rounding of the glass has the odd effect of either magnifying or diminishing.
Yes, exactly, yes, that's right, yes. So if I can detach it from the
like a raindrop falling.
yeah, raindrop, and it assumes this beautiful shape.
So we have this rounded
shape, you see. So then if I haven't got some letters, if you put it on some letters,
yes,
it would magnify quite a bit, as you said.
Monks were probably among the first people to take advantage of spectacles, but they became important for all trades and professions. Presbyopia, the inability to focus on close objects, has always been a common problem as people approach middle age. Unfortunately, this is also the time when skilled craftsmen are at their best. The advent of spectacles enables scholars, printers, bookkeepers, clockmakers, and other craftsmen to extend their working lives for 10 or 15 years.
Spectacles are one of the great revolutions in the West, not developed again in any other civilization. Just in the West you have the development of spectacles which have all sorts of economic consequences, but also it's out of the spectacle lenses that the development of scientific instruments occur. And so very precise workmanship revealed to one civilization, and as far as I can see, one civilization alone, the microcosm, what lay beneath the surface of things, and the macrocosm, what lay in the stars.
Certainly by the 17th century, lens making is not merely a very sophisticated technology, it is the most precise, demanding technique of any by several orders of magnitude. Grinding a perfect lens is so much more difficult, and it has to be so much more precise than almost anything else any European was doing, especially if one thinks of microscopes and telescopes. So glass gives you precision, visibility and control, which are indispensable elements of the new sciences of the 17th century.
As glass was such an important technology in the West, the puzzle is why it did not develop in other parts of the world, such as China or Japan.
So we are then taken to the question of why glass seems to have faded out, as it did in Japan. By the 16th century, the Japanese had forgotten glass as a substance. When the Portuguese brought it, they said, well, they must have dug it out of the earth. We don't know what this substance is. And they called it by a Western name, glass. In China, there was a knowledge of glass, and glass technologies were fairly sophisticated in the 8th and 9th centuries, blowing of glass and everything else. By the time that the Jesuits arrived, there's practically no glass in China.
Isn't it just that glass is very fuel intensive, and so places where fuel are expensive, that it's simply a reflection of the cost, a relatively lower cost of fuel in Europe?
That's right. Pottery is much cheaper than glass. It would be very expensive.
Fuel terms?
Oh yes, I think, I mean, you can put huge numbers into a
glass
kiln.
has to be heated much higher, I think.
And it has to be heated, and you have to keep the kilns alight all the time, whereas you can let the pottery kilns go out. Perhaps part of the clue to the absence of glass is China and Japan's success in producing pottery and porcelain. What is this? This is one of the oldest surviving pottery kilns in Japan. Wood has always been a scarce commodity in Japan, so kilns like this were designed to conserve energy. The heat from the fire at the bottom gradually rises up through the chambers built into the hillside. It is only fired 2 or 3 times a year, but each time the kiln is filled with tens of thousands of items. Although this kiln is extremely efficient by using the heat slowly going up through these 11 chambers, it also required a vast amount of energy. If you take a bundle like this, you need 1,200 bundles like that for a 7-day firing, something like 40 times the amount that you've got here. On the other hand, you did produce vast numbers of pots even in one firing, and this meant that Japan and also China were deluged with pottery. This was ideal for drinking the national drink of China and Japan, a hot drink, tea. With this excellent pottery, there was really no need for drinking glasses. All the fine glasses of Venice and the West were unnecessary here and never developed. But it has one great disadvantage, which is that you can't see through it. Arigato.
In East Asia, if they want beautiful drinking vessels, they've already got lovely porcelain to make it out of. Glass, therefore, that might be a competitor, doesn't have an obvious niche. The niche for the fine vessel is not there. It's already well occupied by highly developed fine porcelain technology. But as for windows, of course, that is a different matter, I must admit. The window in East Asia is essentially not something you can look out of through a transparent weatherproof screen, but essentially oiled paper, which will let light in and keep the weather out, but certainly won't allow you to actually get a view through it. The art of making windows from strips of mulberry paper has been practiced for over 1,000 years. In Japan, where earthquakes are common, glass windows were not very practical. Also, in the summer when windows were removed completely to allow free flow of air through the house, this type of window is lighter and more easily stored. Until the introduction of air conditioning and earthquake-proof buildings in the last century, glass windows were rarely used in buildings in the East.
So you have hardly any glass in India, hardly any glass in China, hardly any glass in Japan before the 18th century. So you have a puzzle. Could China, for example, have had the kind of Western scientific revolution without glass? If you answer no, then you have the problem of what had happened to different civilizations, that one of them had developed particularly lenses and fine glass, which allowed it to see more clearly and more precisely.
Alan McFarlane has a theory that might explain why spectacles were not made in Japan until the late 19th century. He thinks that there is a fundamental difference in eyesight between East and West. It was based on the casual observation that myopia, the inability to focus on far-off objects, seems more common in Japan than in the West. He went along to a routine school eyesight test to try out his ideas on Professor Tokura, a leading ophthalmologist in Tokyo.
This age group of 10-year-old Japanese children, what sort of proportion do you think might be suffering from myopia?
The percentage of myopia is very difficult to say, but we said it's about 30%.
So they would be about 30%, 1 in 3?
Yes.
And when they are about 15, what proportion?
50% in the high school.
50% in the high school
students.
And university level?
University level is 70%.
70%,
I think.
Perhaps the Japanese obsession with minute detail, which is reflected in their art and crafts, is connected to this high incidence of myopia. The Japanese are very famous for their very detailed work, lacquer work, basket work, painting, everything. Then later on, they are famous for their micro-electronics and their micro-engineering. Maybe being myopic is one of the reasons why they do this close work.
But your theory is only the near work.
Yes.
But myopia, myopic people cannot see the far distance.
That's right.
So it is necessary to use the spectacles to see the far side.
Yes. But in fact, until the 1850s, there were very few spectacles in Japan.
The glasses for correcting myopia use concave lenses, which are more difficult to grind than convex lenses that are widely used for reading glasses in the West. Alan McFarlane thinks the lack of experience in glass and lens making is why spectacles were so late in coming to Japan and China.
So my theory is that myopia, through a set of connections, is one of the reasons why China and Japan didn't have a scientific revolution.
The absence of scientific innovation in the East over this 500-year time span is hard to explain. Glass and clocks are just two missing links in the puzzle that separates East from West. Rapid technological change eventually allowed the West to overshadow the once mighty empires of China and Japan.
The two worlds of East and West had remained largely ignorant of each other. The first Chinese junk to sail to the West arrived in 1850, 250 years after the first Europeans had entered the Forbidden City. What the Chinese did know about Westerners was that they had very good military and naval technology, because they'd seen Western cannon in action and they'd seen Western ships. They had more or less formed the conclusion, however, that the Westerners couldn't have much else that was any good, because otherwise why did they bother to sail all the way to China to buy things like tea and silk and rhubarb? So what they were expecting to find was perhaps not a very highly culturally developed set of people, certainly not a people with any refinement or any interesting pertinences of civilization. They were coming to a country that had been described a few years before by the Qianlong Emperor as a mere anthill in the midst of the ocean, so I don't know what they expected to find, but fortunately they stayed long enough to see the Great Exhibition, which must, I think, have impressed them somewhat, and appeared in fact as one of the exhibits, you might say, at the Great Exhibition, much to everybody's surprise, when the Mandarin, Hersing by name, turned up in front of the Duke of Wellington and Queen Victoria and was incorporated in the diplomatic procession by courtesy. I think on the whole a degree of mutual astonishment was caused.
When the Great Exhibition opened in 1851, it attracted visitors from all over the globe. Inside this vast cathedral of glass were exhibits which celebrated the coming of age of the machine. The building itself was a monument to the importance of glass and steel as the key materials of the industrial era.
It was just an extraordinary achievement that this massive building had been put up in record time. I mean, it was an extraordinary structure, 2,000 feet long, 140 feet high, and a massive glass edifice, a real hymn to the achievement of Victorian technology. This was a real chance for Britain to show the world what it had achieved, and also to show its own people just how far they'd come.
At the core of this revolution was the steady growth of precision engineering, which had developed from clockmaking and the desire for increasingly accurate control mechanisms. This fed directly into steam engine design.
The first stationary steam engines built in Britain, in the Midlands and in Cornwall, are essentially a wrapping together of the technologies in boring, distillation and clockwork. And if you know how to put those three kinds of machinery together, you can pump water in a way that suddenly makes all sorts of mining activities viable where they hadn't been before. And you cannot have a stationary steam engine without an extremely good, very carefully engineered control device at the top of the pump. And that means you need a very good clockworking industry.
By the time you have the large-scale clock trades in France, in the Netherlands, in Britain and in Germany, one clockmaker's workshop represents the crystallization of vast numbers of different skills. If you look inside a reasonably sophisticated pocket watch, what you see is not only a remarkable work of art, but also a remarkable piece of miniature technique at a scale which simply hadn't been achieved in history up till then. So it's not just that the watch and clock trades drive forward the regulation of public and private time. They also rely on and then diffuse through many other trades the simple capacity to engineer the most elegant and sophisticated devices. To make balance springs like that, you needed machine tools for lathes and vices, which can allow the manipulation of metal and glass down to very high precision.
Tools like lathes control high degrees of accurate, precise manipulation of metal and other really difficult substances. What this means is not just that one can engineer down to tolerances absolutely undreamt of a few decades earlier, but that it can be achieved over and over again, and that's the key. What machine tools allowed was the production of identical objects, identical, elegant, sophisticated objects, but on a mass scale.
The interchangeability of identical parts revolutionized manufacturing by making mass production possible.
We keep forgetting how devilishly difficult it is to actually make parts from things that are fairly complicated, like spark plugs, to fairly simple things like screws and nails, and to make them so that they are truly identical, so that they fit. Today, manufacture would be unimaginable without interchangeability, right? If something breaks down in your car, you know, one of your spark plugs goes bad, you don't fix the spark plug. You take it out, you throw it away, you put in another one, because you know that the new spark plug that you're putting in is going to be absolutely identical to the one you've just thrown away, except that the other one is broken and this one is fine. Mm-hmm. And this is true for almost any mechanical part that we use today.
In America, the new machine tools were designed for use by unskilled labor. There was no time for lengthy apprenticeships in the fast-growing economy of the United States. In 1851, the Yankee engineers brought their machines to London, to the Great Exhibition.
Some of the most interesting displays were the American ones. There were a whole range of American machine tools and things that had been made with these American machine tools. Colt revolver was the one that was the most striking at the time, and this was a clear demonstration of the American system of manufactures, which was a revelation to British engineers.
It's inconceivable that somebody like Samuel Colt could have made the guns at the price he did, of the quality he did, without his ability to cut those parts with a degree of accuracy and a level of tolerance that was beyond precedent. Now, and these tools were not only incredibly accurate, they were simple to use, in the sense you did not need many years of training and apprenticeship to actually use them. Somebody with fairly rudimentary skills, provided he was good with his hands and had his head screwed on properly, could actually start producing the parts that went into these guns fairly quickly. And that, I think, is one of the main reasons why they emerged, because you know, America's a land of immigrants. A large number of the people who work in these factories may have been fresh off the boat, people who were before that, you know, Irish farmers or, you know, or German textile workers who really do not know how to work with metals. And so if you have an unskilled labor force, you can do two things. You can either train them and take them for many years through training, or you can design equipment that is fairly simple to operate. And this is really what Yankee ingenuity eventually cracked, and it is what eventually explains not only their ability to manufacture these guns cheaply and well, but a whole range of other goods.
By the middle of the 19th century, the United States was undergoing an economic transformation that would eventually make the Industrial Revolution in Europe seem like a sideshow. By looking back over 500 years, fundamental differences between East and West have emerged. To find out more about the roots of this divergence, our investigators will go back 1,000 years to contrast the evolution of agriculture and warfare on the fields and battlefields of East and West.